Our next and main speaker really needs no introduction to this group, but it's worth noting that he has been a climate champion for decades. From his start on Beacon Hill as Lieutenant Governor to his distinguished career on Capitol Hill as a 5-term US Senator and then as Secretary of State, where he championed and ultimately signed the Paris Climate Accord, John Kerry has fought to ensure that the issue of climate was always at the forefront of US policy. Since departing Washington, D.C., his dedication to climate action has only accelerated. Last November, he launched World War Zero, a bipartisan coalition of world leaders, military officials, and influencers united with the goal of mobilizing the public to combat climate change. Last month, in a Boston Globe column, he artfully called out the parallels between the coronavirus and the climate crisis. And he was just named co-chair of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force on Climate. Building on his years of fighting and advancing critical work on this issue, we need his voice now more than ever. I'm honored to introduce my friend, my neighbor, and longtime climate champion, Secretary John Kerry. John?
Amos, thank you very, very much. I trust you can hear me, and I don't care if you don't see me, but hearing me is probably part of this. Amos, thank you. To begin with, thank you and Barbara for your leadership. You guys have been absolutely extraordinary. And Boston is a great city and has always responded to the moment, and largely because of citizens like you, Amos, and also everybody else who's part of the Green Ribbon Commission. I really thank you and congratulate you. I'm sorry Marty isn't there right now. I hope I have to leave after my question period, but you know, these Zoom things have created now a seriatim of daily Zoom meetings, and we seem to be using our time up equally as well as before, perhaps even better because we don't have to travel between meetings. But Marty's been terrific, and I bumped into Marty. I think I was in Beijing where I was meeting with the Chinese on this, and Marty was there with the Conference of Cities and a number of other places, and he is not a latecomer to this. Boston is particularly challenged as the 4th most vulnerable city in the United States and 8th in the world, according to the World Bank. And so we've got real challenges, but you all have been stepping up to it. And I was reviewing in the Boston Climate Action Plan and also looking at the Green Ribbon goals, sort of where we are relative to where we were supposed to be. And I think we're on track, we're doing well. But on the other hand, I want to convey to you this morning a higher sense of urgency, which really requires even business leaders. I mean, I got a lot of friends in the corporate arena. You know, I'm having conversations with folks at BlackRock and Blackstone and Goldman Sachs and various banks, Jamie Simon, Diamond and JP Morgan and so forth. The business world is ultimately, I think, going to have more to say and more to do in helping us to solve this challenge, this crisis, than almost any other entity. No government has the ability to do what we need to do with climate change. Why? Because we're going to have to find new technologies. We're going to have to push the curve of new products, new building materials, new transportation, building out actually a legitimate energy grid for the United States of America. We don't have one. We have a gaping hole in the middle of our country. The East Coast has a grid, the West Coast has a grid. There's a little line that goes from Chicago across the top of the country, west, and then Texas, of course, has its own grid. But that's it. So you can't send energy from certain parts of the country to other parts of the country. You can't use the benefits of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and all these extraordinary breakthroughs to be able to do a simple thing like have a smart energy grid, where when the wind isn't blowing in one place, but it is in another, you can actually use the energy. All doable, all technology that exists today. We're just not choosing to do it. So even as Boston comes together to take steps to change municipal codes, to do fleet purchase of electric vehicles, to demand more recycling and better ways and so forth. There are all kinds of things locally which have to be done. In my conversation this morning, I don't want to diminish one iota the degree to which every single local step is critical. The old saying about, think globally, act locally. I mean, you've got to do that, but we also now have to act globally in a far more responsible way. When I became Secretary of State, I worked for a number of years with the Chinese as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and prior even to that, before Joe Biden became vice president. And in that capacity, I built a relationship with the Chinese. And so I took a flyer and went to Beijing, where I saw Marty, within days of becoming Secretary of State, I think 6 weeks in. And I did it because I felt convinced that China could move, that we could bring them on board. And there was a dramatic failure 4 years prior to my coming in Copenhagen, where the UN convention, the COP, failed to advance the ball. And the principal reason was Chinese opposition. The Chinese were leading the G77 against any steps. There were willing partners for them in that: Saudi Arabia, Australia, Brazil, a bunch of countries, Poland, that just, are laggards with respect to this. And they remain so even today, as you saw with the fires last year in Australia and the attitude of the Prime Minister. So we still have an enormous challenge. And what we did was we brought China on board for the first time ever. President Obama and President Xi stood up in the Great Hall of the People and announced America's intended emissions reductions, and so did China. Different standard, different choice of ways we do it, but jointly agreeing it was a crisis and we needed to meet the moment. That was the signal that went to the rest of the world. Oh boy, the ball game has changed. Now we're going to have to pony up. And indeed, we worked it for the next 2 years. We went to Paris and we worked overtime to bring India, Modi, on board, to bring Australia on board, to get Saudis to cooperate. And we got 196 countries to sign on simultaneously, all of them to do something. It was a seminal moment. And it had its impact. I want to emphasize to all of you, we were not able to do mandatory reductions. Why? Because the United States Senate is currently made up of a group of people who believe that UN agreements, international agreements, are a ceding of American sovereignty. This is a right-wing thing that's caught hold in the last 10 years. And so any foreign agreement is an anathema to these folks. And so it was impossible to pass anything in the Senate as a treaty. That is why I also had to negotiate an agreement with Iran, which was not a treaty, but an executive agreement, which allowed Trump to just come in and pull out, something nobody anticipated, obviously. So on climate, we have been facing a global, not all countries, but Australia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, other countries have been buying into the denial, to the anti-science, to the procrastination and delay school. And the result is that while there are these similarities, and I wrote about them in the Boston Globe a few weeks ago, between COVID and climate, there's also massive difference of consequence, which matters to every single one of you as you are members of this commission. And that is this. On COVID and other diseases, we can prepare still in ways that will allow us to deal with the pandemic, whether it's trying to jump ahead on vaccines or understanding the protocol of a particular virus better, or continuing what we began in the Obama administration, which was working with China to specifically analyze and understand the coronavirus. We had Americans over there in China working with them. Trump pulled them out. And so this was a self-inflicted wound. And we saw our hospitals have to improvise, create massive new ICUs across the hospital footprint, and a host of other things. On climate, It's different. I took the time to go as secretary to Antarctica after visiting the Arctic. And when I was in the Arctic, the scientists there said to me, you know, Mr. Secretary, if you really want to understand climate change, you got to go to Antarctica. I said, okay. And I walked in one day to the Oval Office, said, Mr. President, I'm going to Antarctica. He said, I wish I could go with you. He was really excited about it. And I went down there where we have scientists from about 20 living there every day working the science. Well, in Antarctica, because of the warming of the ocean, you now have warmer water spilling over the continental shelf, going underneath the ice shelf mass. And that is creating incredible instability in the ice shelf, which you can visibly see. I flew over it, and you can see this rippling effect in a certain band going across the West Antarctic ice sheet. And scientists are literally afraid that that might break off at some point. The Larsen ice sheet broke off a few years ago, floated out to sea to melt, larger than the state of Rhode Island. Another ice sheet broke off the size of the state of Delaware. So big things are happening, folks. And here's the problem. You can't turn them around. You can't turn them around the way we did our hospitals. You can't sort of say, well, we're going to produce more masks, or we're going to get PPE. In this case, we don't know scientifically completely what the effect of going over a tipping point is. And we know that because it's an ecosystem with millions of years of cause and effect in it already, we can't control it in a matter of weeks, days, months, or even years. It's going to take a lot of time. So yes, it's been magnificent that we have been able to see the Himalayas from India for the first time in years, to be able to see mountain ranges, to see clear water in places, to have the effect for a few months of COVID on the economy. But look at the price for getting there. It's great to be able to see those things, but here's the problem. Mother Nature is responding to a fixed amount of CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. And methane is now bubbling up in various places because of the thawing of the permafrost and the thawing of the tundra. And so methane, which is 20 times more damaging than CO2, is running amok around the world. We don't know all the places and we can't control it. And if we continue the warming, there's a vast danger of catastrophic consequence in terms of what happens with the rate change of where products grow, where food grows. Already we're seeing that impact. We had 200 great white sharks off the coast of Massachusetts a year ago. And we see massive change in fisheries where some fish are going farther north to find the colder water. And the warming is having a profound impact on the life cycle of fish because of the spawning grounds that are beginning to change and so forth. I don't want to bore you with the breadth of it, but suffice it to say that people who say, oh my God, we can't afford to do these things, or we don't want to make a choice. I don't want to stop eating meat and all these things you hear floating around. Folks, we have to stay centered on the big things, on the big picture. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere today and growing is taking us now, currently, to over 4 degrees of warming on the planet. When we left Paris, I said to the plenary, no one should leave here believing we've done the job of holding the Earth's temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade. We have not. What we've done is send a signal to the marketplace of the world that 196 countries are together all going to try to do something. But in the end, we believed it was the allocation of capital to these sectors that will make the difference that was going to change the market. And it has. For the first 2 years after Paris was signed, $358 billion went to alternative, renewable, sustainable energy development. The first time ever more money to sustainable energy than to fossil fuel. Huge moment. And we were beginning to move. We were reducing emissions. But then Trump came in. I mean, I don't want to be political here today, but I just say to you, the fact is, he pulled America out of the agreement. The only country that had really moved everybody and kicked everybody and prodded and pleaded with people to be responsible left the table. No other president in the world has done that. And immediately, Poland, India, Australia, Brazil all seized on it. Said, well, America doesn't care anymore. We don't have to care as much. We certainly don't have a watchdog there kicking us and urging us to get things done. So we're in a place today where before COVID, the emissions were going up in every single country. Every single country, folks. Europe as a block, it was going up. United States, it was going up. China, up. China's bringing about 21 gigawatts of power online in the next years from coal-fired power plants, new ones. Yes, they're slightly more efficient than before, but still the dirtiest fuel in the world. So, you know, that is the challenge. Now, here's the upside. Oh, one other thing I mentioned. I flew over the Greenland ice sheet, and I saw in one fjord, the Königsberg Fjord, 86 million metric tons of ice breaking off every day. And you watch it calving, and it's dramatic, you know, huge waves from where it falls in, and then it flows out and you'll see all these huge icebergs flowing out to melt. That's enough water every day to service New York, greater New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey for an entire year. So these are the dramatic changes that are taking place. And now that ice sheet is melting 4 times faster than it was 10 years ago. Last year in Pakistan, you mentioned heat drought and preparation for that. Last year in Pakistan, there were cities that measured 125 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not livable. People were dying just of the heat. So we are poised. We are in 3 storms 3 years ago now, I guess, Harvey, Irma, and Maria. We spent $265 billion just cleaning up after those storms. So you get the picture. So in terms of this conversation today, it is absolutely critical that Boston continue to do what it is doing. Sea level rise is going to happen. It's going to be dramatic. The East Coast is going to get hit. You'd hate to be in Florida, but we're vulnerable. And New York is vulnerable. Witness Sandy. So we've got to start getting ahead of this. And right now we have a frozen political structure, folks. I'm just going to be very blunt with all of you. There are business leaders there, finance leaders. My argument to the Jamie Dimons, Brian Moynihan's, and everybody else is, folks, you got to stop financing these fossil fuel projects for the long-term future. If we build out a natural gas infrastructure, you know there's going to be a battle against stranded assets, and people will then argue, well, we can't, you know, lose the job, can't do this. There is plenty to do that actually does reduce our rate of emissions in order to get the job done. So I know we want to do Q&A here, and I don't want to keep this going, but I just want to say to you, there's a huge upside, billions of dollars to be made, millions of jobs to be created, extraordinary positives to communities. If we were to seize this as a national, international initiative and actually work to get the job done, we're not doing it. Not one nation in the world is doing what it's capable of doing or doing even what is needed to be doing. And so everybody's going to have to be engaged in this debate. And that's why World War Zero, I just had a conversation 3 days ago with Governor John Kasich. We have a bunch of Republicans who are now coming on board. He assembled about 15 different Republican leaders, Governor Brian Sandoval, others from Nevada, from Washington, all around the country, and they all signed on. We have General Stan McChrystal, we have admirals from the Pentagon. We're trying to change the conversation in our country. And like the Lincoln Project, we want to be able to get out and talk to Americans so they will go out and vote climate. If people will vote it, I guarantee you we will win back the future.
Secretary Kerry, that is a great note to pause on. Thank you so much. I feel like you've taken us around the world and all the way back home to Cape Cod with the sharks, and that's what really got us.
The sharks. I've changed my swimming habits, so I want you to know.
On that note, do you have advice for us as a business organization based in Boston? Obviously, we have a global view, but our actions are quite local. What can we do to help advance the state, the national, even the global goals that you're talking about?
Well, I think the most important thing, honestly, is building this movement of accountability. I know it's not the normal role of some of you who are at this table, but the problem is not a lack of capacity to do what we have to do, it's a lack of willpower. And so there's a growing movement in America. Young people are increasingly screaming about divestiture. It's a legitimate argument. We did that with South Africa in the 1960s and 70s, and it changed the country. I mean, it has an impact. So there are things people are going to have to think about to move the needle here. And there may be some discomfort level in some people in doing that. I mean, I'm now, 70 plus years old, whatever, and thought I was going to be retired. And I find myself going back to the position of militancy I was in when I came back from the war in Vietnam, because people aren't listening and they're not doing, and they're being irresponsible. That's why 16-year-olds are going out and striking. And that's why we have a lot of young people who don't bother to vote. What we have to do is get them to understand, if you do vote, you will win back that choice. So all of you, every meeting you go to, and this is not an exaggeration, every meeting you go to, you ought to raise the topic with people who don't normally talk about it. You ought to try to get people that you can talk to, many of you, in ways that others can't, and get them to realize that this is real stuff. $265 billion to clean up after 3 storms is crazy. In 5 days alone, more rain fell on Houston, Texas, a record sort of 500-year storm, which now happens more frequently. More water fell on Houston than goes over Niagara Falls in an entire year. If you've ever stood and watched Niagara Falls, that's just staggering. So, folks, you all can make a difference as opinion leaders, as influencers, as people who don't normally step out into the political fray. We need you. We need you in the fray. We need university presidents. We need our top scientists. We need our Academy of Sciences. We need hospital associations. We need business leaders who are going to make it more imperative as to where capital goes, because we cannot continue to fund suicide.
And how can, here's the question from Andrew Dreyfus, of Blue Cross, leader of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. How do we make that connection between the root causes of environmental and climate issues and the root causes of economic and social inequality? Because as Amos said at the outset, at heart, those seems like one and the same problem at the root.
Well, they are part of the problem. The only way to, I mean, look, business people can make that connection pretty easily to other business people. Better than a politician, certainly better than an activist. And I think, we used to believe in science in America. It's a fascinating trend line. I commend, there are a number of books that are out right now. Naomi Oreskes, professor of history of science at Harvard, has written a terrific book called The Merchants of Doubt. And she traces how certain corporate entities, beginning with Rachel Carson in the 1950s, when she was blowing the whistle on DDT and Dow Chemical, and she won the battle ultimately, as did people win the battle on flammable pajamas, nicotine and cigarettes, ozone, acid rain. But we haven't yet won the battle on these 2 biggies still, sort of virus, medicine, and climate. But they're the same thing. The deniers were more interested in just making money and not upsetting the status quo. And so ExxonMobil knew very well what was happening, because its own scientists told them what was going to happen. And what I'm saying, I'm not saying something radical. I'm saying something that is based in fact and in science and in the history. You can read the court documents. Not most Americans will never see those documents, but Naomi has shown how there's that tracing of that connection. There's also a fascinating book out, God, I've forgotten the title. It's by Catherine Stewart. It's tracing, don't get upset when I say this, but it's tracing Christian nationalism. and the way in which certain churches in America, which are sort of also quite far out on the right, have actually intertwined religion into this pushback against science. And you have to read it to understand it, but there are these different pieces of culture, and you have to push back against that culture and get back to a place where in a democracy, you have a fundamental acceptance that you have to have a basis of facts. 2 and 2 is 4, not 5. But we have people out there today arguing it is 5, essentially. That's what we found with respect to these choices that we face. So we're not able to build consensus around almost any issue in American politics today. It's that polarized. And I think it's going to take business leadership, civic leadership. It's going to take a reconnecting of the American people to facts and science, and depoliticizing it to a bit, if you can, in this highly polarized atmosphere, to get people to a different place. I don't know how you do it otherwise, but I'll tell you what the centerpiece of that is. It's called an election. 9% of Barack Obama's vote went to Donald Trump. 7% of Barack Obama's vote didn't even come out. So Hillary began with a 16-point deficit. And people voted for Trump because they were angry at the political system, rightfully, angry that nothing seemed to be working. They thought he'd come in as a businessman and throw a few bombs, but maybe get some things done that were rational. And we've learned it isn't rational. And we don't have the leadership we need today for this moment in America. And so how do we get it? I'm telling you, folks, I learned this in 1970 when we did the first Earth Day. We brought 20 million Americans out of their homes. We targeted the 12 worst environmental votes in Congress. We defeated 7 of them. And guess what happened? Richard Nixon, President of the United States, signed the Environmental Protection Agency into law. We didn't even have one. We passed the Clean Air Act, safe drinking water, marine mammal protection, coastal zone management, endangered species. All of them came about because environment became a voting issue. Now, when only 55.6% of Americans decide to go out and vote, which is what happened in 2016, you can lose. The way you win, and by the way, the people with the greatest investment in the future, the young people, the young generation, 18 to 25, only 19% voted in 2016. So that's the story. And we got to turn that around. And all of you can help turn that around, really. I hope this election will be the largest voting we've ever had in America. And I hope it will be resoundingly about that future. And it has a chance. It's one of the most important ones we've ever had in our lives.
I think the book, Catherine Stewart, The Power Worshippers.
Yes, Power Worshippers. Thank you.
Great. So tell us a little bit about World War Zero, if you would. Is that the vehicle through which you are trying now to get out to both sides and speak to each other?
It's one of the vehicles. Yes, the answer is yes. Why? Because I think the conversation has to change. We can't have the same old polarized people coming up and screaming at each other. We have to have a logical discussion. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the Republican governor of California, did a lot on the environment. Christy Todd Whitman, who was the EPA director and Republican governor of New Jersey. Former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, both longtime senators, and many other people have come to the table. And Arnold and Governor Kasich and I did a big town hall early March, right before COVID shut things down in Columbus, Ohio. We had 2,000 people come out, and we got people energized and excited and ready to become. That's what we were going to take around the country. Now, we were always, however, Amos knows this because I talked to him about it, we were always going to be more digital than street, organized, because that's how you communicate now. There are algorithms and there's micro-targeting that allows you to really target the specific people you need to talk to. And if we can get the 55.6% up to, when I ran, it was 62.4 or 5% turnout. When Obama got elected 4 years later, it was 63.7. You get the drift. I believe that if we have the ability to isolate people in America. So we're going to have General Stan McChrystal and Admiral Lee Gunn, who was chief of policy and planning in the Pentagon, four-star admiral, four-star general, talk about how this is a threat to America and to the world, how conflict resolution and it's a conflict multiplier for our military, that we're going to have to send young Americans abroad to deal with some of this conflict and chaos that flows from climate change. We'll have millions of climate refugees. We already do have tens of thousands. And you bring this picture to people in a way that says, this is the biggest market opportunity in the world. It's jobs, it's health security, all of the things that we're fighting in terms of the complicated conditions people bring to the table. Not all of them, but many of them, the lungs particularly, and cancer, because cancer is impacted by particulates in the air, which is impacted by pollution. And what we're talking about is reducing pollution, and Americans relate to that. And then finally, the national security jobs thing is really critical. So we think there's a conversation to have with Americans. We bring unlikely allies to the table to have those conversations through Zoom. We've done several Zoom town halls now, but the key to what we want to do is the micro-targeting messaging through the internet, through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. If you can get on there and start controlling that conversation, that's how you're going to get people to vote. And that's how most places are doing it today.
All right. That is, you again, just taken us from the 50,000 feet to right down to micro-targeting, showed us how to do it. We thank you so much. I'm sorry that we have to move on in our agenda.
No, listen, I'm
greatly appreciate your being here with us this morning, and I'll let Amos say a goodbye as well, and we'll turn.
Thanks for having me.
John, your passion on this is absolutely contagious. Thank you for a really stimulating set of comments, and you made it very clear what the answer is. We just have got to turn out the vote.
Right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you again for being with us.
That plus your and the corporate leadership at this table is all critical.
Well, we want to do our part.
You are. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate your time.
Thanks.